Thank you. It's kind of embarrassing. I had a quote from Elie Wiesel, and basically in the word question there's a beautiful word quest. I love that word. And I'm embarrassed to admit that 10 minutes ago I was at the Intercontinental Hotel on the 3rd floor in Boston. And it dawned on me that nobody's here. So it may cause you to wonder, is this guy really worth listening to? Now, having said that, this is a serious quote because questioning is at the core a quest. I'd like to share with you a quest that I went on about 5 years ago with a colleague and friend, David Brashears, who was the cinematographer and director of the IMAX Everest movie in 1996. And in that movie, you may have heard of Into Thin Air by Krakauer, and there's a Harvard Business School case study. In 1996, a massive disaster happened on Mount Everest. Many people died who did not need to die. And that case study is about the decisions leaders make in times of uncertainty that sometimes cause very difficult outcomes. I had taught that case study for about 10 years. I had met David Brashears 4 or 5 years into that. And in 2014, David said to me, Hal, it's one thing to talk about Everest here at sea level in Boston. It's another thing to be at Everest, and you've never been there. And so we basically decided to do an excursion, a quick trip the following spring. He was going to go to the top of Everest, and I was going to go to base camp and into the Khumbu Icefall. So I literally, 2 weeks before the trip, went to the local REI and said, I'm going on a trip. And they said, what do you want? And I said, everything I need for Mount Everest, base camp and beyond. And they said, what do you have? And I said, nothing. And 4 hours later, we had everything to go, including boots, to hike up the trail. About 5 days into the journey, I took this photo, and at that point, I was getting sick and exhausted. Coughing. It was difficult to move, difficult to wake up, difficult to keep going. And there came a point at which I wondered, am I going to die here? And I'm not kidding. I woke up wondering, should I go forward or should I go backward? What's the decision? And it was in that moment, the next day, that I wandered into this monument to Scott Fischer, who was on top of Mount Everest in 1996, 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He was the lead guide. He should have been off the mountain no later than 2 o'clock, and he died. And I ended up standing in front of his monument, and I realized at that moment exactly what David Brashears had told me. It's one thing to talk about Scott's choice to stay on the mountain when you're at sea level. It's a totally different issue when you're getting closer and closer to Mount Everest and you're having trouble breathing and you're wondering if you're going to live or die. I ended up the next day hiking, ascending to Kalapatar, about 19,000 feet. Everest is 10,000 feet, the peak from the right, second peak from the right, watching the sunrise about 5 o'clock in the morning. It was absolutely stunning and beautiful and humbling because at that moment when you can see Everest touching the edge of the universe, you realize you're nothing in this space. And so then, that afternoon I got to base camp. The next morning, 2 days later after sleeping, barely had enough energy, went with Fula Sherpa on the right, into the Khumbu Icefall, and by the end of that journey that morning, I was utterly exhausted. A helicopter came that afternoon, and I came home. And what I learned of many lessons in that journey, that quest, is that there are people that I will bump into, especially in moments like this. We have hundreds of people sitting in this room with hundreds of years of experience. And I left Everest with a commitment that your experience matters just as much as mine, if not more. And it's one thing for me to talk about asking questions and innovation and digital transformation. It's another thing for me to be in your chair as a CFO actually trying to do it. And I just want you to know that that story is there in honor of you, your work. It's not easy. I think I grasp that. But I hope that what I've learned by interviewing and working with some of the most innovative leaders in the world, that it might be relevant to your world. So here we go on a different sort of quest about asking courageous questions. In times and moments of uncertainty like we're living in, questions that demand courage are of the essence. And so you've got Walt Bettinger, who's the CEO and chairman, not the CEO of Charles Schwab. And basically I asked Walt, what is your most difficult challenge as the CEO? And he instantly said, isolation. People start telling you what they think you want to hear, and they stop telling you what they think you don't want to hear. And he said, it started the moment I became a first-level supervisor, and it only got worse the higher I got in the organization. And so you are CFOs. You're at the top of the organization. I don't think any of us at that level can escape this challenge of isolation. And in a world of innovation and digital transformation, isolation is our #1 enemy. And so my question for you to think about for a moment is, what are you actively doing to seek passive data that's not actively coming at you in order to get out of that isolation bubble and not get blindsided? Let me give you 3 quick examples of companies that got blindsided. Peter mentioned, years ago I worked for London Business School. We lived in London. We had a paper-based mapping system. Anybody use the A to Z map for London to get around? You know, you got a few hands going up. It's the guidebook there. Then we ended up going to INSEAD in Paris, and we put away the A to Z paper map, and we bought a Garmin suction cup on your window guidance system. How many of you have those in your closets or somewhere in your house today? You know what I'm talking about, right? Because a few years later, we moved to Abu Dhabi, and we put the suction cups away, and at that point, we took Google Maps, and we had no need for those. Garmin is still a vibrant business, and TomTom is basically a not vibrant business in that transition. Then we came to MIT. And arguably, we don't even need Google Maps because Uber and Lyft can do it for us. Anybody out there in the world of transportation? I don't see anybody. 1. 15 years ago, would mobility have been part of your conversation, that word mobility? I see no. Today, in that world of transportation, it's everything, because it's not about the cars. It's how do you move person from A to B? It might be sharing. It could be a variety of things. And the issue becomes, when these sorts of things come to us, are we getting ready for it? Mary Barra at GM, she is the classic case example, when you look at her young life, that she should not be the CEO of GM, but she's exceptional at what she does. Because here's the deal. Her father worked for GM his entire life. Mary grew up in Detroit. She went to a GM-funded university. Her first job was at GM. Do you get the isolation picture? Then she goes, finally, as an early career professional engineer, she travels to Stanford to get a degree. And when she lands in that new place, she looks around and she realizes these people have no idea what GM is. And if they do, they hate it. And then she said, I even saw non-domestic vehicles. And then her conclusion, I didn't know what I didn't know. At an early age, she realized, by bumping into things that made her feel wrong and uncomfortable, she realized there are things I don't know. And for what it's worth, in the world we're living in, that's the space from which disruption occurs. Think of the last time you were blindsided, individually, as a team, as an organization, or even an industry. That blindside almost always came from the world of what we didn't know. And so again, in the spirit of that question about isolation, I invite you to reflect to yourself for a moment. What are you actively doing today and tomorrow and the next week, actively doing to figure out what you don't know? Because if we don't have strategies to do this, we will get blindsided unnecessarily. That's the challenge. Travis Kalanick, former CEO of Uber, he's the top of his organization. He's the CEO, he's the owner, he's an expert in the business, maybe a little bit charismatic, maybe not. He gets in the back of an Uber car that he doesn't know he's being videotaped. And in that car conversation, the driver starts complaining about the things that are happening at Uber that make his job difficult. What is Travis's response to the driver's feedback and data? You're the problem, not me. He went on the offense, telling the driver all the things that were his issues, not Uber's issues. The video went viral. It was the beginning of the end of Travis at the top of that organization. Power tends to corrupt. Absolute power tends to corrupt, absolutely. This is the challenge of senior leadership. It's the challenge of a CFO. It's the challenge of power. It's the challenge of privilege. I'm going to go back to Walt Bettinger. So here's the deal with Walt. Walt knows isolation matters. Walt is intentional about doing things in his everyday schedule to get beyond isolation, to figure out what he doesn't know before it's too late. Now, before I share with you what he does today as the CEO, let me share with you quickly why he does it. Go back in time. He's an undergraduate in college, the first one from his family, I believe, getting a degree. He's going to get a 4-year degree in 3 years. He's doing it, and he's going to get straight A's. That's his commitment. It's the end of the 3rd year. It's the last class. It's the last final. He has straight A's. He's full of ambition, and he's going to conquer the world. He goes into the last final, and there is a single sheet of paper sitting at every desk that's blank with no words on it. The professor steps in and basically says to the students, I've taught you everything I know about finance and economics and strategy. You've mastered it. You've done well on your midterms. You've done well on your practice sets. You understand that content. And then he said, I'm going to ask you a question now that I believe is even more important than that content, especially as you rise in your career. Here's the question. And if you get the question right, one question, you'll pass the exam. And if you get it wrong, you're failing it. Can you feel the tension in the room? Here's the question. He said to them, you have been in this building, you've worked in this building, you've studied in this building, some of you have slept in this building. Who or what is the name of the woman who cleans this building? Walt did not know. Walt failed the exam. Walt went home and wondered, what's going on here? And who did he meet the next morning? Dottie, the woman who cleans the building. And I've had the chance to watch Walt operate inside and outside of Charles Schwab to have a sense that to this day, that Dottie experience drives the way in which he explores the world. And here's how he explores it. He explores the world with questions. He cares about things happening on the edge of the system, because that's where we figure out what we don't know. We don't figure that out sitting in headquarters. We figure it out being up, being out, being into the world, being on the edge and beyond. And so, here's one of his questions. If you're his direct report, he's got a report twice a month that basically says, you need to tell me what's broken here. What's wrong? What's not working? And if you don't do that, you're going to be in trouble with Walt. Another question for people at a broader level is, inside of Charles Schwab and beyond, my biggest challenge, he tells people, is isolation. How can you help me? And then he shuts up and he listens. And then finally, he's constantly asking people, if you were in my job, what would you do differently? He even asks analysts on analyst calls that question. Not at the beginning of the call, but towards the end usually, he always asks them, and then he's quiet, and he gets their feedback. That kind of data, that kind of passive information, actively seeking it, is the key to asking questions that others aren't asking, to get answers that others aren't getting. That's why they have at Charles Schwab, at the core of their brand, the power of asking questions. Because they've done systematic studies of their best clients at Charles Schwab, and guess what? The best clients ask the most questions and the best questions. No wonder they realize if we can just get clients to do that better, we'll be even better off, and they're doing quite well. So those are the sorts of people I had the chance to interview, to get a sense of how do you behave in the world, to figure out what you don't know, and to start asking questions that are catalytic, that challenge fundamental assumptions that are wrong, and energize people to do something about it in a very positive way. These are people from all sorts of industries, contexts from around the globe, often founders, sometimes CEOs, a lot of different folks, a lot of different contexts, and the patterns were very similar. And some of these people were coming from companies that arguably are some of the most innovative in the world. We do a list with Forbes every year, basically looking at publicly held companies and figuring out, looking at their share price, which companies have an innovation premium where the investors are basically saying, I will pay you more than the value of your current activities because I believe you'll be doing something different in the future. The top 3 companies last year were all in digital transformation: ServiceNow, Workday, Salesforce. They're at the front edge of that. It's a 5-year average. They're not just jumping on and off. They're good at what they do. They're incredibly good at asking questions. Marc Benioff, the founder of Salesforce, his approach to the world for 15 years at Oracle was as a salesperson on the edge of the organization, constantly getting feedback about what's working and what's not working with Oracle software. He then is a bit burned out. He takes a year sabbatical. He travels the world. He's talking to rich people, poor people, religious leaders, government leaders, business leaders. He's talking to large enterprise owners, small enterprise owners, hundreds of them over the course of 12 months. All of that passive data is aggregating in his head to the point that he asks a question other people weren't asking, which is basically, why aren't we selling enterprise-level software like Amazon sells books? He never could have gleaned that question out of some book of questions. He created it by how he behaved, how he spent his days and his weeks and his months. And we know from the data that for those innovative leaders who are pushing the edge with the questions they're asking, they're spending 30% of their time actively out there seeking passive data. Now, fast forward. About 10 years after the founding of Salesforce, this question came up. Why isn't all enterprise software like a Facebook app? That led to their chatter system internally and externally with clients and other innovations. Then more recently, how can we make enterprise-level software more intelligent with AI? And more recently, how can we apply it in new ways? He and his top teams go on listening tours with people of all kinds of backgrounds all around the world. These questions surface from those tours, and they're part of what drives their success. They also have some questions once they have something like, how do we bring AI and intelligence into our system? They have a series of questions that the top to the bottom people are always asking to get things done. They call it V2 MOM. First one is values. What is it that we really want? The second one, vision. Second, values, what's really important to us? The third is methods. How are we going to get it? The fourth is obstacles. What's preventing us from having it? And the fifth is measures. How will we know that we have it? That looks like just a list of questions. But if you were to talk with leaders and senior leaders, especially at Salesforce, those questions are not just a list on a PowerPoint slide. They're a list inside their head that drives how they think about how do we make this new idea work. It's systematic. It's intentional. Now, why are these questions so important? Why does it matter so much to Marc? Why does this stuff count? Peter Drucker said decades ago, in the 1950s, he's a very thoughtful observer of how senior leaders operate. He said the real and important difficult job is never to find the right answer, it's to find the right question. And then he said there's nothing more dangerous or useless than the right answer to the wrong question. In a world full of transition like we're in, the companies, the leaders, they're going to be left in the past are the ones who don't get that statement. They'll be living the wrong questions. Oprah Winfrey knows this. She knows it because she's interviewed thousands of leaders, and she said, ask the right questions, and the answers will reveal themselves. Marc Benioff introduced me to Tony Robbins, and I interviewed and asked him. And interestingly enough, I had my own preconceptions of this guy, good or bad, but when I talked with him, he's actually incredibly insightful about the power of questions in the work we do as leaders. He told me, when somebody raises their hand and says, I have a problem, I say, what's your question? Because all a problem is an unanswered question. So I always take problems and convert them into the questions. So basically, problems are unanswered questions. And I would add, any problem, any challenge that we're currently facing is effectively not only an unanswered, but an unasked question. So here's the challenge. Pretend you just hired me. And you know that questions are important. They're valuable. They matter. They can move your organization to a better place than it already is. But you just hired me, and I want you to turn to the next person next to you as if they were me and explain to them in 30 seconds, here's what you should do differently, Hal, tomorrow. Here's how you should behave differently tomorrow in order to ask better questions that will take our organization forward. So just 30 seconds, here's how you behave differently as a leader in order to ask better questions. Go. Pair off real quickly. Okay. Ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling. I would like you to raise your hand. I'd like you to raise your hand if you are highly confident in the answer you gave to the person next to you. I see about maybe 3% of the hands going up. Is that right? Don't feel too bad, because whenever I ask this question all over the world, I get about a 5% response rate. And what's fascinating to me is that we all intuitively know that asking better questions could build a better world for us. But when it comes down to how do we do it, it's like, I'm not quite sure, right? So now what I want to do is share with you a few things I learned from those 200 people about how they go about asking the better question. So I'm going to give you a frame that may be unexpected, but is crucial. It's a way in which I frame their answers about how you go about asking better questions, and it comes from photography. About 5 years ago, I met the man on the right, Sam Abel, sitting in the front. He's a National Geographic photographer, 30 years on staff. Those are some of the cover stories that he's done. I love photography. I'd done it when I was younger as a wedding and portrait photographer. And Sam and I got together, and we now do at MIT with Santa Fe Photographic Workshops, we do a workshop called Leadership in the Lens, teaching leaders how to ask better questions through photography, of all things. But one of the things Sam teaches, and it's a powerful 3-word concept, is compose and wait. Before I share some photographic examples, think of what Marc Benioff was doing at Salesforce with all those conversations all over the world. He was composing conversations with people who were extremely different from him over and over and over. And then he would just be quiet and listen. In fact, one time I asked Marc, I was standing, I looked at him straight in the eye because he's about my height. I asked Marc, how do you ask better questions, Marc? And he looked me right in the eye. And he said, listen. And then he shut up and he looked at me. It was a long look for like 3 or 4 seconds. I think he was trying to figure out, is Hal Gregersen 100% present? Is he willing to engage? Does he care? And then we had a 15-minute thoughtful conversation about what it means to listen and to learn to the point you get a new question you didn't have before. And this is the point, compose and wait. Here's the photography example. So at the end of the first workshop with Sam Abel, down in Santa Fe, New Mexico, we went out into the square. There was a bunch of antique cars that pulled up unexpectedly. I was intrigued by that yellow one in the middle. I got behind it, and I literally took 67 pictures over the course of 15 minutes. I was committed, because I wanted something interesting to happen through the front windows from the back window. But nothing was working. And then I heard a voice from behind me that said, you might get better pictures from inside of the car. Would you like to get in? It was a very kind voice, and it was an invitation, and I got in the car, and the view was totally different. I got a wider angle lens because it was so tight. And then I literally waited about 10 to 12 minutes, and then this guy stuck his head in the window And he said, "Do you come with the car?" Now that photo looks inevitable. It's like a snapshot that I just happened to take. But what I'm trying to say is, I committed to a scene enough that the owner of the car trusted me enough to let me in. And then I was still committed to the scene enough to wait 12 more minutes. And for what it's worth, the biggest challenge for executives taking our Leadership in the Lens course is not the composing part. What is it? It's the waiting part. When the pressures are on, it's excruciating to wait. So here are like 3 quick other examples. Waiting for breakfast in Hong Kong, it looks inevitable at the 100th floor of the tower in Hong Kong, but it was a 10-minute wait for the right moment. Ditto on the streets of London, and ditto north of where we live on the North Shore of Boston in the middle of this last winter. All of those photos took 15 to 20 minutes of waiting, sometimes in the frigid cold, for the right moment. That's how asking questions works. Compose and wait. So I'm going to give you an example. You're Fatih Gondor. You own a company called Aramex. It's one of the most successful logistics companies in the world, like UPS, FedEx, and DHL. It operates it was founded in Jordan, where he grew up. It operates mostly in the Middle East and Africa. You're Fatih, you're kind of like Travis Kalanick at Uber. Fatih's the CEO, he's rich, he's wealthy, he's an expert in the company, and Fatih is very charismatic when you're around him. He has every reason to be insulated and isolated and blindsided. So you're Fatih, you land in Dubai at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you have a meeting at 8 o'clock the next morning, and you've been traveling across continents, and the only thing you want to do is get to sleep, right? And so if you're Fatih, and you're trying to actively seek passive data, and you're trying to understand some things you didn't otherwise see, how would you get from the airport to the hotel at 2 o'clock in the morning in Dubai? Any suggestions? Taxi is option A. Didn't take a taxi. I heard delivery truck. Did I hear that right? Yeah. So that's the way he thinks. Where could I get some information, some data that would be so disconfirming that it would cause me to ask a different question and see the world differently? So he has a delivery truck driver pick him up. On the way, he asks questions like, what's working, what's not, and why. They're simple questions, but if you don't have the trust of the people, they are going nowhere. But they trust Fatih, and they tell him, and at the end of that short delivery truck drive, Fatih learns the system locally is doing things that are making this driver's job difficult. So the next day, instead of passing by that data, he just tackles it. They changed the whole agenda of the meeting with the senior leaders in the area. Nobody's going to get in trouble here, he says, but we've got to tackle this problem and do something about it. And then they start working through them all day long. That's the kind of leaders they are. That's how he figured out what he didn't know. And these are the kinds of conditions they create over and over and over. This is not the normal world of a CFO space. It's conditions, situations, people, context, places that cause us to be wrong instead of right, to be uncomfortably wrong, and to not run from it, but to embrace it, to be reflectively quiet and let it settle in. Because when that happens, those are the moments that the questions that come really count. They change our world, and they change often the entire industry. But it demands of us that we compose those kind of conditions and we wait. One of the people I hugely admire around this is Ed Catmull, co-founder of Pixar Animation Studios, and for more than a decade, the then president of Disney and Pixar Animation Studios. I'm going to invite you to think for just a moment about your world. And here's the invitation. It's like, what question matters so much to you right now that wherever you are, this luncheon, the elevator, a meeting, driving in your car, you're trying to get an answer to that question. These leaders who ask these catalytic, world-changing questions, that's how they operate. So for Ed Catmull, originally the question was, How on earth can we create a full-length computer-generated animation film? It took him almost 3 decades of life to answer that question, and a lot of questions to get there. Then you get Toy Story. Fantastic success that then leads to a Toy Story 2 experience, where they're pushed hard to get Toy Story 2 out. They pushed people so hard within Pixar that close to 1/3 of the people who work there have carpal tunnel syndrome or some other physical problem that's not going to go away for the rest of their life. And Ed's thinking to himself, but my door was wide open. I had an open door policy, but he got blindsided by that because people weren't telling him that they were getting exhausted with the hard push for Toy Story 2. That led Ed to think very carefully about a different question. A year of reflecting on it landed on how can I build a sustainably creative culture? One that can do not just Toy Story 1, but Toy Story 2 and 20 movies after that, where people don't get burned out, but they're energized. And they're not hurt, but they're healthy. That question consumes him. It's not some consulting question. It's one he cares about. And so he wrote this book about it, and then you go into that space, and imagine your employee going into Pixar. You're reminded when you're walking to the Steve Jobs building in Emeryville, California, when you walk by the huge Luxo lamp, this is a different space. You walk inside, on the left, you've got The Incredibles and Woody, and you go on to the right, and you've got this whole bank of Oscars. Can you feel the pressure of performance going into that space? And then you've got this massive space. This is the end of the day. It's usually full of people. And it's intentionally, that's where the bathrooms are, that's where the food is. Everybody's coming there to bump into other people, to have conversations where they are wrong and uncomfortable and quiet over and over and over. And you finish the day and you've had that kind of experience. So let me tell you quickly about a couple of senior leaders. This is a place where Ed has intentionally constructed a situation where their top directors, who have, in some ways, all the motivation to not get feedback, are pushed into situations where they do get feedback in order to make the movies better. Dan Scanlon, a movie coming out next year, Onward, he told me basically in early development of these movies, they're just tiny little candles you need to shield from the big bad winds in order for them to grow into something brighter and vibrant. And so the question is, how do you do that with these high-profile people? And at Disney and at Pixar, they've got a very specific place. At Pixar, it's called the Brain Trust. So imagine you're Dan, you're at the start of pitching the idea. Most of their best movies, if not all of them, the director's idea is partly their own personal story. So imagine getting feedback about your idea for a movie when it's your own personal story. And the obligation of the other 15 to 20 people who come into that brain trust room, they are obligated, they feel an obligation to give Dan all the positive and negative feedback they can and to ask him the toughest possible questions. The meeting is 3 hours long. Dan's responsibility is just to be quiet and listen, reflectively quiet. He's getting a lot of data that says his ideas are wrong, and he's very uncomfortable. At the end of that 3-hour meeting, generally the directors go home for the weekend because they are beat up and exhausted. But they know it's the only way to make a great movie. To go into that space, to have your ideas scrutinized intently, to get feedback and questions that are super tough, to push it to the next level. And they do a version of that on a daily basis in all parts of Pixar and the Disney Animation Studios. And that's my question again. Where in your team, where in your organization, what's the place, what's the space where people know this is where we tackle the tough issues. This is where we ask the tough questions. This is where we're wrong and uncomfortable in order to build something better than it ever was before. So, it's the same thing when Disney bought Pixar. Big, huge, old Disney company buys Pixar. The first thing they ported from Pixar to Disney was that brain trust logic. They started at the top, making the directors at Disney a little more uncomfortable, a little more wrong in order to get right and to get movies that are incredibly successful. The Frozen directors are going through this stuff right now, and basically that's the way in which they work. One last thing about Pixar and Disney. I had the chance to go with Ed Catmull. He retired at the end of 2018. I had the chance to visit 2 of the 30 events he held with small groups of people at Pixar and Disney, where he shared with them his perspective on the future of Pixar or Disney animation. And in those meetings, Ed shared with those people not answers for the future, but 3 questions they needed to ask from his perspective and answer in order to take Pixar and Disney forward. That's the logic of these places. So this is kind of an interesting quote. Creative excellence is a dance on the precipice of failure, a battle against the allure of safety. There are no shortcuts, no formulas, no well-worn paths of victory. It tests you constantly. Constantly. Who's that by? The CFO at Pixar. You wouldn't have expected that probably. But he was the CFO at the beginning, and he was there for over a decade, including the purchase, the buyout by Disney. And basically, he gets it in terms of the power of creating these situations. So that's what we do. What are the conditions? How do we create them to be wrong, uncomfortable, and quiet? So now, we've got a few minutes. I'm going to skip through this one because we're going to do something that I think matters. Oops, I'm going to go back. First of all, first thing I want you to do, think about your own situation, your world. Are you living in an isolation bubble? There are 3 questions that you might consider that are really important around this. One is, how often are you dead wrong about something at work? If it's been more than 2 weeks, I'd start worrying. It's an isolation bubble. The second question is, when was the last time somebody asked you a very uncomfortable question? And if it's been more than 2 weeks, I'd be worried about being isolated. And the last one is, when you ask questions, how long do you wait for other people to answer? And if it's only 1 or 2 seconds, everybody already knows the answer. So where are the spaces, where are the places where we're asking the tough questions, the response times are long, we might be uncomfortable, and ideally we are wrong. That's the point. So what I want to do to get out of this isolation is to get into the world, create these conditions. Do we have time? I think do we have about 8 to 10 minutes?
Yeah, buddy, actually 11 minutes.
11 minutes. We're going to do something like massively fast. We're going to create conditions where you are going to be able to ask better questions about a challenge that matters to you. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to brainstorm nothing but questions about challenges in a super fast way. Be very careful to my instructions right now because they matter, and here's how it works. You're going to pick a challenge or opportunity that matters to you. I know all of you have one, and you're going to share it with the person sitting next to you. So pick one you can share, a challenge that matters, something you're stuck on, you care deeply about, and you're going to make a difference with it. If you follow the rules I share with you, in 8 minutes, 80% of you will have progress on the issue. Here are the rules. We're going to brainstorm questions only, no answers to any of the questions, and no explanations about why you're asking the questions. So imagine a conversation with only question marks. No answers, no explanations. It's going to be weird, but if you follow the rules, 80% will make progress. I want you to either write down or think in your head all the questions, write them down if you can. You may not have the paper, but we're going to try it anyway. What's your challenge? You've got it figured out. You might want to think for a moment, how do you feel about your challenge? Positive, neutral, negative. And then here's what we're going to do. In those pairs, I'm going to give you 1 minute to share the challenge with the person next to you, and then 3 minutes to generate as many questions as you can, questions only about the challenge. And then we're going to shift to the second person. 1 minute, here's your challenge. 3 minutes, as fast as you can, all of the possible questions. Is it clear what I'm asking you to do? Follow the rules, no answers, no explanations. Person number 1, 1 minute, share your challenge, go. Okay, we're done. I have 3 quick questions. Here we go. How many of you feel a little more positive emotionally about your challenge now versus 10 minutes ago? Hands up. I see a lot of hands up. Here's the word map of what people usually feel before they do it. Here's the word map afterwards. It moves us into a more positive place. 80% of the time, we're in a more positive emotional place by just asking questions about the issue. About 5%, we're worse because we realize the problem's bigger than we thought and we're the problem, right? I'm serious. But it's better to know that after 4 minutes than 4 months. That's the point here. 80% of the time, people see it a little bit differently. Do you find yourself reframing it a little bit differently? Do you find yourself maybe 1 or 2 ideas that you might be able to take it forward? All I know is the data would suggest that if you use this simple exercise with whatever challenge you're facing, 80% of the time, if you just shut off answers and start asking questions, you'll move to a better place. It rarely solves it, but it creates movement. And so my final suggestion to you is the following. Maybe it's the question burst, maybe it's what Marc Benioff does, maybe it's what you're going to be doing, but it's like, where today or tomorrow can I be wrong and uncomfortable and quiet? How can I ask the questions that will cause me to be that way? Let me tell you one quick example from when I got bumped into that moment unexpectedly. I was interviewing Lior Div, who's the CEO and founder of Cybereason. They deal in cybersecurity. They just recently got a $100 million investment from SoftBank. They're exceptional at what they do. I was interviewing Lior on camera, and I said to him, how do you know if the bad folks are in the system? What was Lior's response? Wrong question, Hal. Seriously. And he laughed, and then he said, they're in the system. Wrong question. The question is, where are they? What are they doing? What's their intent? Who are they? What's next? It's a totally different way of looking at cybersecurity. And I had the chance to interview him recently again, off camera, about the algorithm creators who are trying to outwit the bad folks. And here's what he told me. Those algorithm creators, their questioning is getting accelerated. The only way to keep ahead of the bad folks is to ask faster and faster questions. And the questions are becoming more simple and more generalized and bigger. Instead of, is this computer talking to that computer when it shouldn't, it's, who are they? Is it a cyber attack? Is it espionage? What's the intent? Those are very difficult questions. And the highest level questions are getting answered by a combination of AI and incredibly smart people who actually are good at themselves being wrong and uncomfortable and quiet, and it's the only way Cybereason can beat the bad folks. It's by combining AI with these people who ask great questions to create the future that will hopefully keep us safe and protected. So good luck. I wish you well. Question away. There we go.